We are living in a time where more than technology and geopolitics, which is traditionally the two themes that we spend a lot of time on this podcast on, it's trade and tariffs and Trump. Three other T's that are dominating headlines.
President Trump has loved tariff for 40 years now, but the reason he loves them keeps changing. Fundamentally, I think what it comes down to is the president really likes tariffs. It makes him the center of attention. It feeds into a zero-sum view of the world.
Professor Jason Furman, Aetna professor of the practice of economic policy, jointly at the Harvard Kennedy School as well as the Department of Economics at Harvard University. Professor Furman is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, from where we've had a couple of guests earlier on the podcast as well. Professor Furman also co-teaches EC10, Principles of Economics, the largest course at Harvard. Previously, Professor Furman served for 8 years as the top economic advisor to President Barack Obama, including serving as the 28th chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors from 2013 to 2017, acting as both President Obama's chief economist as well as a member of his cabinet. Who do you think are the winners of the current trade strategy being adopted by the Trump administration?
India had been in a position to really benefit from trade shifting from China to India, from ending up with a lower tariff rate than China. Right now, we're on track to a 50% tariff rate starting at the end of August on India, so it might be the exact opposite.
If you were now briefing the Indian Prime Minister, what would you advise him on how to both negotiate in the short term with the US, but also how to adapt in the long term? Do you think Trump will strike a deal with India ultimately? Other than countries like Mexico, do you find any other countries have played their cards? One has heard now arguments that China has played their hand very well by bringing out their key leverage point in the form of their control over rare earth minerals. You said you were surprised that countries didn't band together because together they might have had much greater leverage over the US. Why do you think that didn't happen?
I thought to myself, wow, if Canada and Mexico, which are part of this three-part trade agreement with the United States, can't stay together, how are other countries around the world going?
There's some talk that, this is India's 1991 moment when, because of global circumstances, India then launches its massive liberalization reforms. Do you see for places like Europe and India, that opportunity to really reform domestically? It's my real honor to have you today on the podcast with us. So welcome, Professor Furman.
Good to be with you.
Professor Furman, we are living in a time where more than technology and geopolitics, which is traditionally the two themes that we spend a lot of time on this podcast on, it's trade and tariffs and Trump. Three other T's, I would say, that are dominating headlines and have gotten intertwined with, of course, technology and geopolitics as well, and are really at the top of the agenda for most business leaders as well as government leaders today around the world. All countries are trying to scramble to figure out what this will mean for them, for their economies, and also for their relationship with each other, but of course with the US. So I think that the topics that we are going to be discussing today with you and getting your perspective on couldn't be more topical, more pertinent. And so I want to start off with a big picture question first before we delve into some of the specifics. From where you stand, what do you think is going on in this world of tariffs and trade? What can explain the kind of upheaval in a way that the world has seen it's unleashed on it? What do you explain? How do you explain all of this?
I'm pausing for a moment here because my answer to your question keeps changing. And I think part of why my answer to your question keeps changing is that President Trump has loved tariffs for 40 years now, but the reason he loves them keeps changing. So if you had asked me this a few months ago, I would have said that this was about the trade deficit and we want to lower the US trade deficit. No, I don't think tariffs are the cause of that. I don't think tariffs are the solution, but I thought it was a misguided effort to lower the trade deficit. At this point, I'm almost hearing more from the administration about how excited they are about how much money. And we really are getting tens of billions of dollars every month. It'll be hundreds of billions of dollars for the year. And they seem to frame that as if that money's all being sent to us by foreign countries, which is of course not true. But that revenue motive to me almost seems to loom larger. That being said, if you ask me a couple months from now, I'll probably have another explanation for it. And so fundamentally, I think what it comes down to is the president really likes tariffs. It is a tool that, at least as of now, he has an enormous amount of discretion to wield, although the courts may decide otherwise. It makes him the center of attention. It feeds into a zero-sum view of the world. It's happening, more on impulse than any, single coherent economic theory.
Is there really no broader objective you feel at play here than just, let's say, the revenue goals that seem to be the latest explanation for what's going on? If you had to posit, what could be some other, let's say, deeper or bigger objectives at play here? Could it be that it's I think as you've also spoken about, it's the fiscal deficits that the US government, or the debt levels that the US government has, and an attempt to really bring that down? This is seen as the way to do it. Could it be much more linked to the geopolitics and the geopolitical objectives of the US vis-a-vis China, Europe, etc.? Or is it really just the revenue targets?
As I said, that's the latest that you hear the most about, in part because that's the place where you are seeing concrete results. I think most of that revenue, or the majority of it at least, is coming from American consumers. But, leave that aside, it's real. And there is revenue coming in. Favorable interpretation of all of this has been that the president is just trying to negotiate better deals with other countries. I was never particularly hopeful that this is the case. This is the case. You'd want to see deals that were more like 0 for 0. We cut our tariffs to 0 in exchange for other countries cutting our tariffs for 0. Instead, the deals that we've seen so far, and really they're sort of sketches of a deal, they're not all the way through to all the details, but anyway, those deals have been more like the United States having 15 or 20% tariff in exchange for other countries maintaining low ones. So it does not seem to be a desire to use negotiating leverage to level the playing field and have freer trade. So I would sort of rule out, at least for now, that motivation.
And if you were to think about the economic advisors that are around President Trump, and if you were to dig deeper into how their worldview might be, or their economic worldview might be, what might this suggest, other than, of course, what we attribute to President Trump's thinking, if anything else, other than what you've obviously mentioned?
So there's been a big change in the way President Trump has approached tariffs in his second term relative to his first term. And some of that mirrors the change in his advisors. In the first term, he took about a year and a half to study the issue of China, culminated in tariffs on, I believe it was about $35 or $40 billion of imports from China. This time it took weeks. We had tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China. And then within months, we had tariffs on basically, $3 trillion worth of stuff. That's just much, much faster, much, much larger than his first term. If you look at his advisors this time, they are, first of all, more believers in tariffs than the comparable advisors were in the first term. And they're also more believers in enabling President Trump than the advisors were in the first term. To some degree, I don't know that it's the advisors that are causing the change so much as the change caused Trump to pick different advisors than he picked the first time around. But whatever it is, I think he looks back at his first term, maybe with some disappointment, thinks he was overly restrained by people like Steve Mnuchin and Gary Cohn, wants to, avoid what he sees as that problem happening again this term. And so we're seeing much more what happens when you let Trump be Trump.
One of the other frames I typically try and use, Professor Furman, to understand the motivators behind any kind of policy decisions is to see who are the winners and who are the losers. So if I were to ask you the same question now, who do you think are the winners out of the current trade strategy being adopted by the Trump administration, and who are the losers, both within the US, let's say, and on the global stage?
So first of all, the most important thing to understand is that in aggregate, it's losses for the United States, it's losses around the world. US GDP growth this year looks like it'll be maybe around 1.5%. That compares to 2.5% last year. Inflation is coming back up, and consumers are paying more. That being said, there are certainly within the United States winners and losers. Some of the most protected industries like steel may benefit from this, although even there, some steel companies gain and some steel companies lose. When you're protecting things that you make, it can give an edge to them. Now, some of what we're protecting are are mangoes, coffee, and bananas. We just don't have a lot of mango, coffee, and banana producers in the United States. So there it's mostly about consumer, not about the industry. When you look at the rest of the world, it's really subtle. To some degree, what matters is your tariff. That affects, trade, but also your relative tariff. So to take just a very extreme example, anyone can export something just as easily to the United States. And this is dramatically oversimplifying. And you get a 15% tariff slapped on you, but every other country in the world gets a 16% tariff slapped on them. Your country's going to actually benefit. A lot more exports are going to come out of your country. And so as you look around the world, relative tariff rates are starting to matter quite a lot. So Japan and Korea are at 15. The Southeast Asian countries are at 19. That could shift some stuff back to Korea. India had been a place where a couple months ago you might have thought would be in a position to really benefit from trade shifting from China to India, from ending up with a lower tariff rate than China. Right now, we're on track to a 50% tariff rate starting at the end of August on India. So it might be the exact opposite. All of these country comparisons are extremely fluid because the rates keep changing. But there will be some winners around the world, and they'll be the lucky countries that benefit from trade diversion.
So this differential, right, that you point to, the relative tariffs that are getting imposed on countries, there seems to be beyond just the revenue target piece that we mentioned as might be behind the current objective at least, there seems to be some other logic to it. Is it that there's a certain amount of geopolitical favoring going on to certain countries versus others in the forms of, let's say, lower tariffs for certain geopolitical friends versus higher tariffs for, let's say, geopolitical either adversaries or those who are not necessarily in favor? Or is there a predominantly economic logic to it?
I don't know what the logic is. It does not seem to be overly geopolitical. If you look at the original list on Liberation Day, and you looked at the list of countries and the list of tariff rates, you would have no idea from those numbers which countries were strong allies of the United States, which countries were real adversaries of the United States. There just wasn't much correlation between the initial tariff rates and the relationships. There's maybe been a little bit more correlation as these various deals have worked out, but again, not a huge amount. India is a country where I thought Donald Trump and Modi had a good relationship.
Yeah.
Thought it was an important alliance for the United States. Maybe in a slightly different way of handling it on the two sides, we'd be talking about, a 15% tariff rate on India, just like Japan, or 19%, just like Vietnam. But instead, we're talking about 50. And some of that feels to me not the inevitability of the relationship between the United States and India, but maybe a set of contingent events and the like. And so, geopolitically, this doesn't seem right. Economically, it also doesn't seem right. I mean, the United States has a 10% tariff on the UK. They're an incredibly close relationship. They're not an overly complicated relationship for the United States. We run a trade surplus with the United Kingdom. They don't have a lot of trade barriers to the United States. So I don't think there's much, economic or geopolitical logic, except for the fact that, it turns out 10% right now is like winning a prize in the competition we're in, because it doesn't get any lower than that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm reminded of, my own, I did the Harvard negotiation program while I was there. And it seems like a classic case of anchoring so high that, as you're rightly saying, everyone who's getting 10 or 15% is walking away really happy because anchor seems to be really high.
And they're not totally irrational. I mean, there'll be some things, Europe's at 15, UK's at 10. There will be some exports that shift from Europe to the UK to take advantage of that lower tariff. And so, could the UK economy end out ahead out of all of this? It might. It would be a small positive because there's a lot of negative things going on as well. So this anchoring thing there's this real psychology to it. There's some actual objective economics to it as well.
Yeah, how do you expect now businesses from both within the US, businesses outside of the US to now respond, right? I think we've seen over the last few months different strategies being adopted by, let's say, Chinese companies, right? This, I think you've mentioned it as the deck chair rearranging effect also, right? Where China tries to shift production to places like Vietnam, etc. But talk to me you tell us more about how you think businesses are likely to respond? What is the kind of spectrum of strategies that you expect now businesses to adopt in response to these varying levels of tariffs around the world?
Yeah, so the first thing to understand is there will be large gross shifts. So for example, if you're selling something to US customers, if you can shift that to the United States. Now, for some things like shoes and t-shirts, it's not even close to profitable. But there's certain auto parts, for example, it's better to import them, but it's not so much better that if you can make them here in the United States, you will. But then there's other things, even within the auto sector, where you're selling into a foreign market. You don't want those parts coming into the United States, getting a tariff, and then being disadvantaged when you sell back into a foreign market. So the things to a foreign market will actually, even if you're doing them in the United States, you might migrate them abroad. And so you'll see these just large shifts, even within individual industries. Same thing around the world. And the difficulty for businesses is they don't know what the tariffs are going to be 6 months from now. Getting a little bit clearer than it was a couple months ago, but it's still only a little bit clearer. And so how much do you want to make permanent, irreversible changes to something that itself might change? Probably want to wait a bit and figure all of it out. The last thing I'd say, though, is capitalism in the United States is becoming a little bit more personalistic around a single leader. And so if you can do what you can to curry favor with that leader, you might get a better deal on these tariffs. If you enrage this leader, you might get a worse deal on the tariffs. And so you're seeing both companies and countries, being much more personalistic about these decisions than you would have seen them do in the past.
You, of course, I think argued in a recent piece, I think in the FT, if I'm not wrong, that I read, where you said you were surprised that countries didn't band together. Countries didn't come together because together they might have had much greater leverage on over the US and President Trump and the Trump administration. Instead, countries have ended up taking, as you were saying just now, these personalistic deals, like let me try and get the best deal and I'm not really going to worry about anyone else. Whereas, game theory, etc., would suggest that there's maybe a different strategy that you could have adopted that could have been more optimal for everyone else. Why do you think that didn't happen?
Well, game theory says two things. One is there was a different strategy that would have been better. But the second is that there's also a very strong incentive for any individual country to defect from that strategy. To me, the most telling was Canada and Mexico. They were two of the first countries targeted by Trump. At first, you thought they were going to stand up together against the United States. And then Mexico went a different way than Canada. Mexico got initially what looked like it was going to be a better deal than Canada was getting. I thought to myself, wow, if Canada and Mexico, which are part of this three-part trade agreement with the United States, can't stay together, how are other countries around the world going to? And so the United States never did an attempt at a multilateral negotiation. There were all these rumors about a Mar-a-Lago Accord, bring all the countries of the world to Mar-a-Lago, redo global exchange rates, make it like the Plaza Accord around exchange rates was in 1985. The United States never attempted that. It treated this entirely as bespoke, and every country has played into that bespoke approach. And the result is the United States, in some sense, has prevailed over lots and lots of countries around the world. But that prevailing is a real Pyrrhic victory, because prevailing is defined as the U.S. having very high tariffs. And the one country we know is definitely hurt by all of this is the United States.
And do you think that the US, if you would just stick with that game theory perspective for a second, how did the US manage to, let's say, break Mexico away in that situation where if Mexico and Canada had stayed together, they would have both benefited? How is it that the US managed to get Mexico to break out of that?
I don't know if the US did or if Mexico and President Sheinbaum just understood that her interests and her country's interests were better served by separating from Canada. When this initial separation happened, Justin Trudeau was the Prime Minister of Canada. President Trump had, some real issues with Justin Trudeau, and she probably pretty quickly grasped that joining together with him would put her in a worse position than trying to cut a separate deal. That's another one, by the way, I wouldn't have predicted. I thought that woman president of Mexico would not be the type of person that Donald Trump would care very much about would develop a strong relationship, would have camaraderie. He's had a lot of complaints about Mexico over the years. And so I thought Mexico would be in for something much, much worse. Ended up getting, but it turns out, there's different ways to handle Donald Trump, and it's pretty hard to predict ex ante who's going to crack that code and who's not going to.
Other than countries trying to move some parts of their manufacturing to the US, etc., as you were saying, and then the personalistic approach that you've also recommended, do you expect that the movement of production facilities away, let's say from, if I was China, moving into Vietnam or moving into Mexico, this kind of strategy will get adopted more and more? One. And second, do you expect that trade patterns themselves will become more regional, or Asia will start trading a lot more with itself, so trading partners will change? What's your sense on those two likely pieces coming out of these churnings?
Yeah, we've already been seeing this. Since 2018, bilateral trade between the United States and China has fallen, but trade between the United States and a set of countries that the IMF has called connector countries, say Indonesia, Vietnam, has grown. And that is basically a rerouting of where things are coming from. That reflects just how strong the economic benefits of globalization are, that it will find, some which way to get globalized. When you talk about connections between the rest of the world, I'm not sure. A couple months ago, that's what I thought would happen. But I also thought more countries would work together to stand up to the United States, and that hasn't happened either. A basic principle of the global trading system since the establishment of the GATT after World War II, then turned into the World Trade Organization, is something called most favored nation, which is if you have a tariff rate on one country, you have to have that tariff rate on every other country. Everyone is now breaking most favored nation with the United States. They're having different tariff rates with the United States than they have with other countries. Once you've broken most favored nation with the United States, is Europe going to end up with different tariff rates with, Latin America and Asia and, Africa? Maybe it will. And then you could end up having a world where rather than this trading system that frankly was reasonably complicated, but at least had some limit to its complexity with this MFN principle, that gets blown up and it is every country for itself figuring out its tariffs against every other country.
So in this case now, other than countries like Mexico, do you find any other countries have played their cards well? One has heard now arguments that China has played their hand very well by bringing out their key leverage point in the form of their control over rare earth minerals. Would you agree with that assessment? And other than, let's say, Mexico, what other countries have played their cards well?
I think, frankly, most of the countries that have struck deals with the United States have gotten the best deal they could get, assuming the paradigm was bilateral. So once you accept the premise that you are going to strike a bilateral deal, I think most of the countries that struck deals did the right thing and got about as good a deal as I could imagine. The only country that has been successful in pushing back is China. They got the United States to back off of much higher tariffs, got the United States to allow the export of some advanced microchips for AI, and that doesn't surprise me. China has a lot of leverage. For China, the United States is a customer that's very nice to have, but not must have, but very nice to have. For the United States, China is in many cases a supplier of materials that is an absolute must-have. Can't make batteries, can't make motors without ingredients that are coming from China. And so that's given China quite a lot of leverage. So if the countries that have stood up to the United States and tried to aggressively strike a better deal, the only country I think that has gotten itself into a better position because of that is China. Almost every other country that's fought back, I think, is going to unnecessarily suffer because of it.
And so why have other countries not been able to find those points of leverage? If the one shining example in this negotiation back and forth with the Trump administration is China, and China has used what seems to be leverage what I have that the US desperately needs, why haven't other countries, even if they were of smaller size, etc., been able to use the same strategy by finding those those points of leverage that would be critical?
I don't know. Look, a lot of U.S. electricity comes from Canada. Early on, there was an indication they might shut that electricity off. That would be a hardball way of playing it. Do I think that would have worked out better for Canada or enraged Trump even more? I'm not sure. But some of the most extreme moves were not tried. Instead, the retaliation Canada has done has largely been sort of classic tariff stuff, where it's put tariffs on U.S. things. That's raising prices for Canadian consumers. That's costing jobs in Canada. And Canada could end up suffering more from its own retaliation against the United States than it does from the U.S. tariffs in the first place. And just to be clear, Canada's well within its rights if it wants to try to fight back and get a better deal. That is totally fine with me. They should make the choice that they think is best for their country. But I think so far the choice they've made has not succeeded in getting Trump to back down. It's only succeeded in inflicting more harm on Canada.
Yeah, it seems like the countries that seem to want to be seen as complying or appeasing or appealing to that personalistic approach that you were talking about, it seems like that also doesn't really work. So I'm quite surprised personally why some of those countries are not actually moving on to more hardball tactics.
There's a limit to how much democracies are willing to do that. Almost every single thing here is positive sum. The country that's selling something gains from selling it. The country that's buying something gains from buying it. The essence of trade is that it's good for both parties. So almost any threat you make is going to hurt yourself in addition to hurting the other country. The other thing I'd say is we're having this conversation in August of 2025. I could come back in 2 years and for all I know, every single thing is reversed. And we have a huge tariff on Malaysia, and we've eliminated the tariff on Indonesia, and who knows what for what reasons.
Is your sense that allies here, the friends of the US, allies of the US in its geopolitical battle, economic, technological battle with China, that these allies, the friends, whether it's across the ocean, whether it's the European allies the US has traditionally had as very steady friends, or Japan, Korea, Canada, Australia, others, and then maybe a third tier of friends, let's say, of the likes of India, do you think that this will ultimately really impact the relationship of these countries with the US, fundamentally alter them, fundamentally alter their dynamics? Because that's what you're hearing from many of these countries, that we cannot fundamentally trust the US anymore. It is, as you were also saying, to each nation on its own now, and that whatever impression you might have had of the US as being your friend, as your ally, as your partner, is just you painting a much rosier picture in your head than what actually exists. So is your sense that there'll be a fundamental shift in the US relationships with its friends now? Or is it a sort of a blip in the road and a few months later everything will be fine and Europe and Australia and Japan and Korea and Canada and India will be just as they were, as friendly as they were?
Look, I'm not an expert in this topic. My perception is, number one, the United States has built up some of these relationships, like with Europe, the UK, its close allies, for decades and decades and decades. And that doesn't permanently alter very easily. And there's a lot of robustness to them. Moreover, different countries behave in their self-interest and behave in irrational ways. So I think this is taking it to another level, but it's not entirely unprecedented by the United States or by other countries to do various protections for themselves. And then finally, there's a set of very strong incentives where, the countries have mutual interest. So for the longstanding U.S. allies, I guess I'm not that worried. I'm still a bit worried, and I don't think it's good, and I don't think we should be doing it. There's other countries, though, that have more of a choice. And, China is, a country that itself is quite problematic in the way it deals with other countries. It doesn't make it super easy for anyone in the world, but it has a lot to offer through Belt and Road. It is a bigger trade partner for the majority of world than the United States is. It has been escalating some of its efforts to get countries into its orbit. And so do you have some countries that could have gone one way or could have gone the other way that don't have, the 60-year relationship that the United States has with Europe? I'm more worried about that. But even there, There still is so much fickleness in all of this and so much interest that I'm not sure it's permanently lost, but it's, to me, a greater sort of path dependence type risk.
Professor Furman, in a recent chat with, I believe, the director of Bruegel, you mentioned that Europe should use the current situation to implement some necessary domestic reforms. After the talk of 25% and 50% tariffs on India, similarly to what you mentioned for Europe, there's some talk that, this is India's 1991 moment, when, because of global circumstances, India chooses to liberalize, right? So 1991 was the year when India then launches its massive liberalization reforms. Do you see, for places like Europe and India, this as that opportunity to really reform domestically? And if so, if you were today talking to Europe and India, what kind of domestic reforms would you say this is the right opportunity or right time to do?
Yeah, so I certainly hope that that's the case. And that's the issue, which is if you retaliate against the United States, you're hurting yourself. Now, that is justified if you think you can get a better outcome from the United States. But if you think the United States is going to be oblivious or just escalate, then you've just needlessly hurt yourself. If you undertake domestic reforms, then you can really benefit. Within Europe, there's still enormous trade barriers within Europe, whether that's services, whether that, including digital services, including the financial system. Getting rid of essentially those internal trade barriers is something that Europe has control over. They don't need Donald Trump for that. They can do that themselves. Reducing some of the excessive regulation, doing more borrowing at the level of Europe, more investing in infrastructure. There's, a long list of things, lots and lots of people have been advocating in Europe for years. Mario Draghi just wrote a big report advocating it. Letta wrote one before Draghi did. And so a lot of people know this needs to happen. Maybe this would be an impetus to it happening. I would say the same thing for India. I am less sort of familiar with exactly what list of things I would do in India, but there's certainly no doubt that it is still vastly easier to do business in India than it was in 1990, but still a decent amount harder in a lot of dimensions than elsewhere. And Raghu Rajan has argued, I think pretty persuasively, rather than putting a lot of money into trying to fabricate microchips in India, taking advantage of the enormous strength in services and a greater future in services, rather than trying to imitate sort of low-wage, low-value-added manufacturing that you've seen in other countries. That is, I think, a promising approach.
Do you think that argument, right, so which I'm familiar with, what Professor Rajan has made, do you think that works well in a less globalized, much more tariff-driven, much more nationalistic world economic system as well?
Well, I think if anything,
India would benefit greatly if it could improve its services exports. Right?
If anything, it might be an argument for it. The President Trump's obsession is with good. All of these tariffs are being placed on goods. They're not being placed on services. He doesn't look at the trade balance in services the way he does in goods. Anything, I'd say there's a little bit more of an advantage to services that I wouldn't have been as focused on a year ago.
Of course, now the US, when it comes to services, especially driven by digital services of especially the big tech firms, I'm assuming, you'll probably know the number better, I'm assuming that the US runs a massive surplus there vis-a-vis other countries. And that would be obviously a very rational reason for why President Trump is not overly concerned about the services piece of that. So I wanted to take that opportunity to ask you about the impact all of this is having on some of those big tech firms. How do you perceive set of tariffs and churns in these trade deals impacting what I would say today might be considered the economic crown jewel of the US economy, which are the big tech firms that seem to continue to grow. How do you think this will impact them?
Yeah, so first of all, let me briefly talk about digital goods. And the biggest digital goods producer is Apple. Their world has gotten more complicated because they might build more stuff in the United States, which is costly. Some of the parts are costly, might be losing access over time to the Chinese market. Then when it comes to digital services, first of all, you're not being very directly affected by the tariffs. Basically, two economies in the world that seem to be capable of producing these digital services, the United States and China. In part, that's because of the scale that you need to make AI work. In part, it's because of the financing that you need to make AI work. Maybe there's a certain amount of first mover advantage that both countries continue to benefit from as well. And so far, at least, internal dynamics of AI, what inventions are happening when, have mattered much, much, much more than any of these policy trade type things.
And is your sense that in that sort of context, the US seems to be managing its, twin objectives or geopolitics on one side and trade quite well? I know you've been an advocate of things like the CHIPS Act, etc. Is your sense that if we were to now step back and look at how that geopolitical objectives vis-a-vis countries like China and Russia, etc., and then the trade objectives as we're trying to make sense of, do you think that the balance is now being achieved fairly well?
It's been perfectly decent. I think reducing some of the sort of regulatory fears the AI industry has had in the United States has been the right thing. I could argue either side of the United States exporting the AI chips to China. They're going to figure out how to make these at some point. I think there's only so much you can slow them down. A lot of the AI I actually think is positive sum, where countries are going to learn from each other. I don't think it's all a zero-sum, winner-takes-all type of contest. So I'm not positive that we've been handling it right on China, but there's not an obvious right answer. But, mostly this isn't policy. This is a group of people who are unbelievably talented, taking advantage of some unbelievable improvements in, processing power and in data availability. Some of these ideas aren't brand new, but the ability to exploit them and take advantage of them is brand new. And, the most important policy ingredient to all of this in the United States is immigration. And that's the big difference between the United States and China. China has 1.4 billion people that it can call on the talents of. The United States has, 8 billion people if it plays its cards right and is willing to let people come and contribute to the United States. We wouldn't have anything resembling the tech industry broadly or the AI industry specifically were it not for our immigration policy. And of course, that worries me because I'm not sure how long we can count on that immigration.
Yeah, since you've touched upon AI, let me take the opportunity to delve a little bit deeper into the impact of AI on our economies as well. Is your sense on AI vis-a-vis productivity? AI will massively end up enhancing productivity in the US economy and let's say the global economy? Because there have been people who've argued that it's not clear whether it will.
So I am optimistic and excited about what AI could do to productivity growth. If you look at economists who have tried to go through each category of what we do and try to understand what could be automated, what couldn't be, you tend to get increases in annual productivity growth of anywhere between 1/10 and 1 percentage point. Now, the tricky thing here is, let's say I told you for sure AI is going to add, 7/10 a year to productivity growth. You still don't know what productivity growth is because you don't know what would happen to it without AI. And so that's where I'm pessimistic. I think without AI, we were probably going to have slowing productivity growth as you basically were running out of ideas effectively and taking more and more effort to squeeze. And so the net of sort of ex-AI productivity growth slowing, AI offsetting that, my guess is we'll get more productivity growth. I think it'll look not like crazy transformational, we've never seen it before, but maybe we end up with 2.2% productivity growth instead of 1.7. And don't get me wrong, over time that accumulates, it adds up. It will be a wonderful, wonderful thing, but it won't be like you're looking around and the world just looks different and faster paced than it's ever looked before.
Is it likely that AI will impact productivity of different nations differently? So if we were to use the traditional metric of the World Bank categorization of nations, for example, if you were to slice and dice countries like that, is your sense that productivity goes up higher in developed countries, the middle tier of countries, or the least developed and developing ones?
I think probably developed countries, because there's more of an advantage to replacing higher paid labor than lower paid labor. Also, AI looks like it might be either substituting or complementing. Either one can be good for productivity growth. More at the higher end, the skills distribution, and there's just more people with college educations and higher in those rich countries. The one thing I think will be less of a factor than people think for productivity is which country invented it. The foundational models, could end up being commodity-like, that, they're all pretty similar to each other. one of them has a 6-month advantage, but at some point, right now a 6-month advantage matters a decent amount. 10 years from now, I don't think it's going to matter that much. What's going to matter more is the applications you build on it, the way you incorporate it into your businesses. That won't be quite as centralized as the foundational models. And moreover, you don't need to be the originator of that to get the productivity gain. You just need to be the user of it. In the early stages, huge gains are to the countries producing this technology, but ultimately what's going to matter is who can use it and use it well. That's not necessarily the same as who can produce it.
And as far as AI in jobs is concerned, what's your where do you stand on that debate? Of course, there's the debate that much like any other technological wave in history, AI will maybe take some kinds of jobs away, make them irrelevant, and hence the people doing those jobs might be affected more. But at the same time, it'll create a lot of other kinds of new jobs. So, of course, the tech optimists or the AI optimists tend to argue that net, you'll have more jobs. It's just the job different kinds of jobs will get created. And then, of course, there's the other set of people who are saying, no, this is clearly going to replace a lot of people, a lot of jobs. Where do you stand on that debate?
I am generally quite sanguine on the job situation. Now, I am not at all certain. And I should say I co-teach Harvard's introductory economics class, as you said in your introduction. In our very last class, my co-teacher and I have a debate on this question. And he argues that jobs are going to be threatened en masse in a way we've never seen before. And I argue the other side. The arguments I make, one, you get new types of jobs, as you just said. Two, you get more of old types of jobs. When people are richer, they want to go to restaurants more. You hire more wage. Three, it replaces parts of jobs. You're a local truck driver, then it may drive from place to place, but you still need a person in the truck to help unload the stuff and talk about, the invoicing or whatever it is with the delivery people. Next, it lowers the cost of doing stuff. And so you may actually want to do more stuff. When spreadsheets were invented, the number of accountants went up, not down. And that's because, isn't it great? You can now have an accountant with a spreadsheet. And then finally, and this gets into the issue of how it will affect different countries differently, is it can affect relative wages. If you're less competitive, it's not necessarily that your job disappears. It might be that your relative wage goes down. And so I think it is more likely to show up as changes in inequality than it is as changes in jobs. And by the way, when I say changes in inequality, it might even be a decrease in inequality if what it does is replace skilled labor, or it might be an increase in it if it replaces unskilled labor.
I want to move to a quick segment, which we call the briefing segment. Professor Furman, if you were almost back in your previous job as the chief economist to President Obama a few years ago, let's say you were back in that job, what would be your top priorities in dealing with, let's say you were advisor to the US president, your top priorities you would recommend to him or her in dealing with, let's say, China, one, and let's say India on the other?
So I would say on trade, it's pretty simple. There's China and there's the rest of the world. With the rest of the world, you want as much integration as you can. No country is that more important and the benefits potentially larger geopolitically than between the United States and India. And then second, China really does have a set of problematic practices, but I would say the United States does not have the leverage to deal with them on its own, just like, by the way, other countries didn't have the leverage on their own to deal with the United States. So we need to build a coalition. And to build a coalition, the coalition can't be a coalition that goes to China with the goal of getting them to buy more soybeans from the United States. India is not going to join with us on that. It has to be to go to China with some rules-based, international level playing field that everyone can agree is fair. So work closely with the rest of the world to deepen engagement, work closely with the rest of the world to take on China.
If you were now briefing the Indian Prime Minister, what would you advise him on how to both negotiate in the short term with the US, but also how to adapt in the long term?
I would say that you really need to reach a deal with President Trump. It's not fair, the setup that we have right now. India is being treated really badly, but he ultimately has the well-being of over 1 billion people that he's responsible for. And just about any deal would be better for those people than the situation India has found itself. And then to rededicate to, showing that it's now the most populous country in the world. It is the highest growth rate of any of the world's large countries. What can be done to continue that and to basically try to be what China was 25 years ago and follow that.
How would you advise a company like Apple today?
Honestly, as much as it makes me sort of want to vomit, to make a gold iPhone and deliver it to the president in the Oval Office. I hate to say it. I think that's what I would have done if I were CEO of that company.
Let's now move to what we call the rapid fire segment of the podcast, Professor Furman, in which I'll ask you these questions, and my request is to keep the answers as brief as you did with the briefing questions, as brief as possible. Do you think Trump will strike a deal with India ultimately, let's say in the next month or two?
I really hope so. And the current situation seems to me completely unsustainable. And so I think something resembling sort of quasi-rationality will win out. So I will say yes.
Is Trump's trade war protecting American jobs or hurting them?
Hurting them.
What's the biggest economic risk facing the U.S. In this coming year or two?
That the global situation extends to financial markets and the United States can't satiate its enormous borrowing needs.
Will the U.S. end up pushing countries like Brazil and India into a China-led trade order?
I hope not, and my bet is not, but unfortunately, I'm not 100% sure about that and wish I was.
A few questions on AI. Do you think AI will end up being a zero-sum game between countries, as we were discussing earlier? Or do you think that a couple of our countries, much like industrialization showed us, will benefit much more than some others?
Massively positive sum. Except maybe in the military sphere, but outside of the military sphere, massively positive.
Net, will AI lead to addition of jobs or destruction of jobs?
Roughly neutral.
On trade and tariffs, is a large trade deficit with a country like China inherently a sign of economic weakness?
No, just different countries have different patterns of production and consumption. That's totally normal and natural.
And the US puts very high tariffs, let's say 50% on India, or whatever number it does on, let's say, Brazil or China eventually. Who do you think pays the price? The country, China, India, or Brazil, or American consumers, or someone else?
The large majority will eventually be paid by American consumers.
Does a Buy American policy strengthen the US domestic industry? Or is it primarily going to lead to, as you've been, I think, saying, higher costs and less efficient production?
As I've been saying, higher costs and less efficient production. A lot of examples of protectionism getting in the way of productivity growth.
Will the US succeed in pressuring Europe to weaken its economic ties with China? Or is the current kind of trade regime going to end up pushing Europe to increase its trade and investment with Beijing?
I'm not sure. I think China is doing its best to actually drive Europe away with some of what it's doing. So how China handles trade is going to be more important than anything the United States does in this regard.
For critical tech like semiconductors, advanced AI chips, should national security concerns always trump the economic cost of more globalized production?
Unfortunately, these are dual-use technologies. The majority of the use is not military. And so you're going to have to think about both the economic and the national security side both into account.
Yeah, great. No, thanks so much, Professor Furman. This was fun doing the rapid fire segment with you as well. And of course, traversing the complex world of the Trump tariff regime. We end every podcast with now two very brief questions, which are not rapid fire, which is, for people, audience that's listening to this podcast today and are interested in the kinds of themes you and I have discussed today, what books would you recommend for people? One, and any other podcast guests that you'd recommend as well?
So Our Dollar by my colleague Ken Rogoff is a great look at the global economy, from the perspective of the United States, mostly on the financial side. I do think at a time like this, you want to step back and look big picture, what has made some countries rich, some countries less so. And a terrific book from a couple of years ago, How the World Got Rich, was a great broad panorama of that. And then finally, guests on this podcast, I don't know, maybe go with Ken Rogoff next.
Great. No, thank you so much, Professor Furman, for being generous with your time and your thoughts on what is clearly a world that few are familiar with, few can make complete sense of. So thanks for sharing that, and hopefully we'll be back with you maybe a year or two later, as you mentioned, and see how the world has changed even more dramatically, or hopefully not.
Yeah, and the only thing that would make any prediction of mine wrong is if everything is exactly the same as the way it is now. If it is exactly the same as the way it is now, then I will admit I totally misunderstood the dynamic.
No, of course. But thank you so much for taking the time, and thank you for all that you do, both at Harvard and beyond. It was a pleasure having you on the podcast.
Good to be with you.